So, when you think about slavery in the ancient world, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably that a person is considered property. And, well, you're not wrong, but you're also not totally right. Today, we're going to dive into an article by Dr. Sonu Kumar Gupta that shows us why defining slavery is one of the most complex and fascinating challenges for any historian. Let's get into it. And this quote from the great historian M.I. Finley really just nails the central problem. Legally, it seems so simple, right? A slave is property. But when you start to unpack that, it gets messy, fast. How can a human being also be a thing? That contradiction, that paradox, is exactly what we're going to explore.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with that core paradox. Then we'll trace the possible origins of slavery. After that, we'll look at three essential frameworks historians use to analyze it, first through law and philosophy, then through scale and society, and finally through the social condition itself. Then we'll wrap up by talking about why all this definitional work is so critical.
Okay, so the first big idea to get your head around is that there's no single one-size-fits-all definition. To really get a handle on ancient slavery, you need a whole toolkit of different concepts and approaches. Let's start at the very beginning with the question of where this idea even came from. That brings up a huge question. Before you have these massive, institutionalized slave economies, where does the very idea of categorizing another human as unfree even begin? Well, according to historian Gerda Lerner, the blueprint for slavery didn't actually start with war or conquest, as you might think. No, she argues it started much closer to home, literally, within the patriarchal family structure. So Lerner's argument is really groundbreaking. She says the very first form of subjugation happened inside the family unit, where women and children were seen as dependents without their own social identity. This created an ideological template, a way of thinking about a person as being fundamentally under the control of another. That same logic, she argues, was then just scaled up and applied to outsiders. So in a sense, gendered inequality laid the groundwork for institutional slavery. Okay, so if the idea of slavery might have started in the home, how did it become formalized? Let's turn to our first framework and look at how the Greeks and Romans actually wrote this into their laws and built entire philosophical systems to justify it. In Roman law, the answer was brutally, chillingly clear. A slave was legally classified as res. That's the Latin word for thing, an object. This meant they could be bought, sold, inherited, or rented out, just like a piece of land or a farm animal. Legally, they had no personhood at all. But of course, a legal definition wasn't quite enough for everyone. The philosopher Aristotle took it a step further. He actually tried to justify slavery by rooting it in nature itself, creating this incredibly influential and, frankly, dangerous idea of the natural slave. Aristotle came at this from two angles. First, there's the argument from above, which was all about the good of the state. He said slavery was necessary because it freed up citizens from manual labor, allowing them to participate in politics and philosophy. He even called slaves animate tools, living instruments. Then he made an argument from below, saying that some people are simply slaves by nature, that they lack full rational capacity and are better off being ruled by a master. It was a complete philosophical defense of the whole institution. All right, so we have the legal and philosophical justifications down. But this brings up another massive question for historians. When does slavery go from just being a feature of a society to being the thing that defines it? This is a huge, huge debate. And this leads us to a really crucial distinction that historians rely on. What exactly is the difference between a society that simply has some slaves and a genuine slave society? The answer tells you everything about the role slavery played. And there are two main schools of thought here. On one side, you have historian Keith Hopkins, who proposed a quantitative rule, basically a numbers game. He said if more than 20% of your population is enslaved, boom, you're a slave society. But then you have M.I. Finley again, who pushed back hard. He called Hopkins's idea number mysticism, arguing that 20% is just an arbitrary line. For Finley, the real test was qualitative. Did the ruling class fundamentally depend on slave labor for their wealth and power? That, for him, was the true mark of a slave society. And what's really cool is when you apply these ideas to the data. Look at this chart. If you use Hopkins's 20% rule, you can see classical Athens, at about 30%, is clearly a slave society. Roman Italy, back in 225 BCE? Not quite. At 15%, it's a society with slaves.
But fast forward to the late Republic, and wow, the enslaved population has shot up to 35%. It has absolutely crossed that threshold to become a full-blown slave society. Okay, so we've looked at the law, and we've looked at the numbers. But what about the lived experience? Beyond all the abstract frameworks, what was the actual social reality of being enslaved? To really get at that question, historians often turn to a powerful concept from the sociologist Orlando Patterson, the idea of social death.
Patterson argues that slavery is much more than just forced labor or lack of freedom. At its core, it is social death. It's the violent, systematic stripping away of a person's connections to their family, their ancestors, their community, their heritage. You become, in his words, a social non-person. It's a profoundly dehumanizing state. And he argues this condition of social death stands on three main pillars. First, there's natal alienation. This means being cut off from your past, from your family, and even from any claim to your own future children. Second is the total power of the master, an absolute, unchecked control over your very existence. And third is general dishonor, being placed at the absolute bottom of the social ladder, denied any form of respect or status. Building on this, historian Keith Bradley focuses on the deep psychological trauma of enslavement. He talks about the moment a person is enslaved as a kind of psychological rupture, a sudden, violent break that completely shatters their sense of self, their identity, and their place in the world. So, after going through all these different frameworks, legal, societal, social, let's pull it all together. Why on earth does it matter so much to get the definition of slavery right when we study history? Well, the crucial point here is that we have to move beyond that simple person as property idea. To truly understand ancient slavery, we need this whole toolkit of concepts. We need to think like a lawyer, a philosopher, an economist, and a sociologist all at once. And most importantly, we have to remember that for the ancients, the very definition of what it meant to be free was shaped in constant, direct opposition to the condition of the slave. And all of this leaves us with some really meaty questions to chew on. Thinking about how these different ideas connect to each other really helps us see that defining slavery isn't just some dry academic exercise. It's fundamental to understanding power, identity, and the human condition itself. I hope this explainer has given you a solid framework for tackling this essential topic.